So I think a lot of my hypercriticism of the United States comes from a space of just the consciousness that we could be doing a lot better. We're kind of in charge, and I think that there are a lot of positive aspects to U.S. hegemony. I just wish we could do it better. I think we're like 95% of the way there.
Welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast, brought to you by political expert Robert Morris and that man you wish would stop interrupting him, Rory McElhone. How are you, Rob?
No complaints, Rory. It's the Thanksgiving holiday is on its way here in the United States, and we're all very excited about that. It's sort of the big holiday in my family. So
okay. Have you been enjoying the World Cup?
What was it? A buddy of mine said there's two kinds of countries in this world: the kinds that care about football and the kinds that have been to the moon.
I was going to put a little pin in that. I was going to say that America does seem to care about soccer a lot when you consider that they usually, they have a good track record of making it to the World Cup.
And losing spectacularly?
Well, most countries do. You have to be honest. It's the taking part that counts. But no, America usually turn up, but they are very passionate fans. They generally, a lot will arrive, but also very mannerly. You never hear any trouble about American fans at the World Cup.
Well, joking aside, it definitely over the course of my adult life, the World Cup has become a progressively bigger and bigger thing.
Well, I was checking what sports, how popular sports are, which sports are the most popular in America. So soccer's now more popular than the likes of NASCAR and stuff.
Oh, that's not too surprising. NASCAR has been sort of a regional thing, but that's certainly bigger than it was. I think we hosted a World Cup. Was it?
Oh yeah, 94.
94, and it was sort of mystifying for a lot of people. It's sort of like, well, I guess we should care about this, and then our guys got eliminated very quickly, and it's like, hey, we've stopped caring about this.
Well, since America has done quite well against Wales, I thought we may have a episode where we're positive on America instead of maybe saying they're a terrifying monster we're trapped with.
Well, I think that works pretty well for me. I'm actually quite pro-American. I think a lot of my criticism and
it's where all your stuff is.
Well, it is where all my stuff is. In fact, indeed, and I'm actually quite invested in the.
You'd be quite miffed if it disappeared.
It would not work out well for me, Rory. It would not work out well for me. So I think a lot of my hypercriticism of the United States comes from a space of just the consciousness that we could be doing a lot better. We're kind of in charge, and I think that there are a lot of positive aspects to U.S. hegemony. I just wish we could do it better. I think we're like 95% of the way there.
It could be worse. It could be worse.
It could be so much worse. I'm very conscious of that. And I think a lot of my fear and a lot of my criticism, the things that I criticize, I think are the things that move us further towards it being worse. I don't think the Trump presidency would have been possible if it weren't for the excesses and idiocies of the national security state leading up to Donald Trump. I mean, folks like, I don't think it's easy to forget now because it's something that's basically disappeared, but without the Islamic State, Donald Trump would not have been president.
Okay. You think so?
Oh, yeah, no way. I mean, but it was I'm not saying that it's exclusively the Islamic State that led to Donald Trump being president, but it was a very close-run thing. A couple 100,000 votes here or there.
Oh, yes.
Hillary Clinton would have been president.
It did seem to be a lot more apathy for Hillary than, love for Trump, it would appear.
I think that's certainly true. Hillary Clinton was sort of a historically bad candidate. But there was also a lot of real discontent and a lot of real betrayal. And I think with Donald Trump, the real moment that I point to, and maybe I'm biased because this was the only thing he ever said that I identified with, but there was a point in the 2015 debates, the Republican debates, where he just absolutely pilloried and humiliated Jeb Bush, sort of ended Jeb Bush's political career by pointing out that this Iraq war that every establishment Republican in 2015 was still attempting to defend was an incredible catastrophe for the United States. And it was also a Watergate level plummet. It created a Watergate level plummet in the trust for the U.S. government, in the just faith in the basic decency or competence or truthfulness of the U.S. government. I mean, you want to talk about the origins of QAnon and conspiracy craziness. You can, I mean, it's a deep-seated part of the American character, but in that sort of mode of approaching politics, becoming as dominant as it is today, it's WMD. It's the fantasy that we were going to go into Iraq, and we had to go into Iraq because he had a nuclear bomb or something. And that's it's the foreign policy stuff that I focus on and that I harp on so much is a problem for other countries, but it's also deeply, deeply damaging to the United States, a country I love and a country whose potential I firmly believe in.
Well, just as a slight aside, do you remember at the start of the special operation in Ukraine, there was a big thing about, the Americans can now not get to the space station because they can't use the Soyuz anymore? And then a couple of months later, SpaceX was like, here you go. And then NASA then nudged a meteorite out of the way. It wasn't actually heading for Earth, but it was a test. And now they're basically saying, yeah, we're going to have moon bases kind of soon. So, in fact, it just shows you the sort of power of America. It almost feels like that's just America idling. It does three incredible things. And it's almost like there's not that much fuss about it.
Yeah, there's some truth to that. I mean, we just do have extraordinary reserves of wealth and power, and a lot of them, a lot of them are used spectacularly, but also I would argue a lot of them are poorly used, and I would like those resources to be better used. So it's not, and I think I can point to examples. Even over the past year or so, where the United States has been using its power well. And I think it would be great if we focused a little bit more on that rather than the hyper-militarized set pieces that Washington, D.C. has created for us to focus on.
Yeah.
I'm more partial to diplomacy. I think that the United States has been exerting itself in some really interesting ways through a State Department. The State Department is the U.S.'s diplomatic arm, and it used to be a very prestigious part of U.S. government. I think it got more or less as kind of semi-established in the 20th century. I guess Nixon was a vice president. H.W. Bush was a vice president. This idea that, the vice president was sort of where you were the person in waiting to be the next U.S. president. But it used to be the State Department. The State Department used to be this sort of the most prestigious of the cabinet.
It's a bit like that in the UK. The foreign minister tends to have, it's like, you're out and about showing off to dignitaries, which is somewhat what you'll be doing when you're prime minister. So it tends to be a good stepping stone.
Yeah, and I think that's the case in a lot of countries, is that the foreign minister is out there meeting all the competition.
And also knows all the languages, so it makes your country look good.
Indeed.
That's the one person that knows all the languages.
So my cynical approach is a very cynical approach to that I could take is that, well, really, for most countries in the world, what their most important relationship is how they can interact with the U.S. hegemon. So it just sort of makes sense for their foreign minister to be the stepping stone to the head of state or head of government, rather. And in the United States, the foreign affairs just aren't that important at this point. We are, as you pointed out, with those, that ability to pull off that hat trick, three extraordinary things nobody pays any attention to. One of my great frustrations is that foreign affairs just aren't that important to the United States.
Is it because America is so, powerful, it doesn't feel like it needs to worry about other countries as much?
I think that's very much the case. I think that our main foreign policy concerns are mostly drama. Mostly, how can we figure out how to justify these defense budgets? How can we find a convenient enemy which is kind of sad because we can and we do so much more in these large government agencies that nobody really pays any attention to. We are occasionally, I mean, there's a fair amount of fraud, waste, and abuse, but there's also pretty extraordinary work being done by the diplomats of the U.S. State Department, by aid agencies. And it would be nice if we could construct a narrative that the U.S. public cared about, other than let's get scared of China or let's get scared of Russia, because there's a lot out there that the United States does that's frankly incredible. The problem is that the United States is so self-absorbed and so, for lack of a better word, not autarkic overstates it, but is so self-sufficient. We are less exposed than any other country in the world to dependence on any kind of foreign trade or foreign resources.
Well, I think a great example of that is quite often if you go around the world, taxi drivers can tell you exactly how much the fare is in USD if you so choose to pay. But Americans would rarely care what their currency is. You know, the average citizen, obviously, if you're in business, you'll care, but the average citizen doesn't really care what their, the dollar is worth to other currencies.
Yeah. And I think we'll really know that, the U.S. decline, the U.S. empire is falling. The only real indication of that I would, the one that I would look out for is when the United States actually starts giving a toss about what is actually happening in other countries, because I see so very little of that. Embarrassingly, so yeah, who won the U.S. Wales?
Oh, it
match?
was a draw. America did have an incredible goal, and then Wales got a penalty near the end.
So the U.S. population is 330 million. What is the population of Wales?
Yes, I did see a chart. America has the biggest population in the World Cup, and I think Wales has the second smallest. I think Qatar might be smaller, but I guess if you include all the migrant workers, it might be higher. So yeah, Wales is about 2 million.
That's
The other funny thing I thought is the group they're in, Iran is in. So it's England, America, Wales, and Iran in the one group, and I think just Iran is having a tough time of it.
Wow, those are some games I might want to pay attention to, actually.
Did you see, England destroyed Iran, even though Iran managed to break their own goalkeeper's nose in the first 10 minutes.
Yikes.
The players didn't sing the national anthem. Like, it was, you know how some players know the words and some don't? Just none of them did at all. So, yeah, Iran's having a bad old time of it.
Yeah, Iran is not in great shape. And I think it would be great if the United States could just stay out of it and watch it happen. As going with my long-established thesis that the United States is always stronger when it acts diplomatically than when it attempts to act
Well, it reminds me of how
Germany
goes on. Apparently, it's seen as one of the best soft powers. It hasn't got militarily involved since pretty much World War II. And it quite often it can get deals done without the use of force. But yeah, America can do that because it's quite willing to use force when needs be.
It's overly willing to use force. There was this fantastic tweet. I think it was Gregory Brune. It seems like over and over and over again, the United States has to keep trying to find a way to use military power in a successful way, no matter how many times it fails. Well, how about we try using something other than military power?
Yeah, but you talk about justifying these big budgets, but is it not just a way, the average American can quantify how rich America is? Because is the defense budget not about 3%?
Something like that.
Which, while it's bigger than most countries, isn't crazy. Like it was running about 5% during the Cold War. And it just shows that there's a lot of money there that you could keep the military where it's at and just have it look scary and not necessarily invade anyone else. But it feels like there's a lot more could be done elsewhere. For instance, healthcare. I know there's this sort of perception that, America spends all this money on its military so Europe can have nice social care. But the UK's, the UK government spends less money in healthcare than the American government. I know the NHS is currently on its knees, but you still walk in for free and get treated. While in America, it just seems like a big insurance nightmare. And it's expensive for the taxpayer.
Of course, yeah, we have the worst and most expensive healthcare system on the planet.
Well, for the developing
Of
world.
course, if you're in the top, if you're in the, I mean, the developing world's catching
Well,
up as
the
well.
one they
I
always
guess
bring up is Cuba. It apparently has magic or a lot of cures, and it does have a very good healthcare system.
they're pretty good. I think there's some qualifications.
Oh yeah,
of
it's
that,
hard to know because
they could be made.
have you been to every country in the world and broke your leg and got to see how everything got treated? There's only so much you can do with facts and figures.
Well, the United States, if you are somebody with great health insurance in the United States, either through a Fortune 500 employer, perhaps a great public sector union, something along those lines, there is no place in the world that you would rather have a complicated, high-end medical issue. If you are a 60-something or a 70-something who has a new kind of cancer and you have the right insurance, there is no better place in the world to be than the United States. Well, certain parts of the United, not Appalachia, but Texas, New York,
California.
Ohio, California. These are places with the best care in the world. However, if you break your arm as somebody with poor health insurance in the United States, it can. I mean, a broken arm is unlikely to be something that bankrupts you, but it can, if you end up being uninsured and you take an ambulance ride, that can
That's one of
bankrupt
those
you.
scary things. It's like a horror story we have over here, but you have to pay for ambulances. It's sort of just a foreign concept.
Yeah, it's a horror story, but it's also very, very true.
I remember someone explaining in the TV show ER, the reason everyone gets taxis is because they're cheaper than ambulances.
There's some truth to that. Yep. No, there's not. No, sorry, there's not some truth to that. That there's simply truth to that. I think that if I were ever in a serious accident, I would do my damnedest to avoid a ambulance if I could. That's just common sense in the United States. But we're falling off track here, Rory. We're going to talk about good things.
It's a
about
good
the United
episode.
States.
We apologize.
This is Thanksgiving. We are going to be grateful for the United States. We're going to be positive about the United States. And I think one thing is to say that's true. If you're in the top 20% in the United States and you have good health insurance, it is the best healthcare in the world. The problem is the other 80%, those who are not adequately insured. It's not just being uninsured, it's being inadequately insured. I think at this point, I'm probably inadequately insured. I think I haven't seen what my new cost is. I'm finding out because it goes up every year, but I probably should be paying in the neighborhood of $1,000 a month for the privilege of paying for all of my healthcare because I've got a deductible, which means that I pay for the first $12,000 worth.
Is it almost like a retainer for a lawyer?
Yeah, kind of.
Because it feels like you pay that, but it could still cost you more.
Yes, absolutely. But the thing is, if I get hit by a bus after paying $1,000 for a month, I only pay for the first $12,000 of getting hit by a bus. And then thereafter, they'll pay for it.
You make it sound like the bus you have to pay for the bus to constantly crash into you. And then after a certain period, it will crash into you for free.
Yeah, I guess that's sometimes what it feels like in the United States. Man, we're really not doing our come on, Thanksgiving episode. Good things about the United States. Good things about
something
US
we're talking
policy.
about good things America was doing that no one paid attention to. I just noticed that they were giving a lot of basically food, corn, which is something America has a lot of, to Central African nations like Sudan. But it was just like, oh, here's $100 million worth of corn, but no one seems to care.
Well, that's very worthwhile. And I would say that Sudan is definitely a great example of the United States doing something not just worthwhile, but very, very helpful. Are you familiar with how things have gone in Sudan over the past few years or so?
Sudan used to be the largest country in Africa, and then they had a civil war. So there's now South Sudan and, Sudan Classic.
Yes, Sudan. Yeah.
And I heard one issue was South Sudan had all the oil, but then all the production was in Sudan. So it hasn't been quite as rosy as they maybe thought independence would have been.
It hasn't worked out very well for South Sudan. It's a grim story, and actually, that's also not a very good story for the United States because we were one of the biggest actors in helping South Sudan become independent and launch directly into a civil war that has killed hundreds of thousands of people. But again, this is the Thanksgiving episode, and I want to talk about Sudan itself. So Sudan itself, the monstrous leader, Omar al-Bashir, who was responsible not just for decades of repression of South Sudan before it was independent, but also the Darfur genocide, you may recall. It was a very big issue in the aughts. So Omar al-Bashir, this monster who was responsible for all of that, finally, in part because South Sudan became independent and he was all of a sudden much less capable of bribing the populace of Sudan, found himself kicked out of power in April of 2019. So what happened then was quite complicated. The protest movement, the forces, the civil society forces that pushed him out, made a somewhat uneasy deal with the remnants of his military junta. So essentially, there was a democratic transition that was agreed upon with some input from international actors, whereupon the military would hold on to power for a more or less 20-month period with a civilian prime minister, and then there would be a full transition to civilian control around the end of 2021. So, of course, what happened at the end of 2021 was the military said, F this transition, we're staying in power. And that's how we got the coup of 2021, which was basically the military aspects of this transitional government booting out the civilian aspects and saying that's that. Now, the Sudanese military had a lot of reasons why they thought they could get away with this. They had been a counterterrorism partner with the United States, which usually is a kind of a blank check for African strongmen, sort of get out of jail free, go be, whatever kind of so-and-so you want card. They had that. And importantly, Sudan is an Arab country. There's many folks who would question that one way or another.
Yes, it's on the boundaries.
Indeed. That's a very, very, very complex issue. If we started talking about that, we'd be here. That'd be the balance of the episode. But they're a member of the Arab League, and they are close to, this is the military leadership of Sudan, is close to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So they had the counter-terror card, they had Saudi Arabia and the UAE funding them. So they assumed in October of 2021 that this will be great. We're just going to step right back into power and it's going to be fine. And the United States said no, simply said, no, you're not going to do that. We didn't have to do a military intervention. We didn't have to drone strike anybody. We didn't even really have to sanction them. There were a number of carrots that were put in place because of this democratic transition that the United States had offered to Sudan as an encouragement for this sort of thing. And we simply said, we're not going to deliver. We're not going to deliver this to a military dictatorship, let alone a military dictatorship that is actively slaughtering protesters. And it's great. We didn't send in the CIA to fund militias. We didn't do it. We're just simply saying no.
You broke your end of the deal?
Yeah, keep up your end of the deal and applying diplomatic pressure. The Department of State still exists. It's famously been abused, even before Donald Trump, just abused and neglected for the entire war on terror era. But these are some of the most knowledgeable people in the U.S. government about countries outside of the United States. And they go and they do really boring stuff that probably doesn't make for great journalism copy, but they just go and they meet with people and they pressure them and they try to bring people together. And about a couple weeks back, they got the junta to sign on to another deal with the protesters. So Sudan is back on track for a kind of diplomatic transition.
Okay, so a civilian takeover?
Civilian takeover. Now.
Oh yeah, don't hold your breath.
Yeah, don't. But it is a lot better.
Yes, it's going in the right direction, all things considered.
Exactly. And it means that because throughout this, and part of the reason why the United States was unwilling to let this go was because throughout this period, since the October 2021 coup, this military junta has been faced by a heroic protest movement. So that dying in the streets is going to stop, and is hopefully going to stop. And there's going to be a negotiated process. And this military junta knows that they can't just get away with throwing over the table and trying to set themselves up as the new Omar al-Bashir. And that is not something that would have been possible without the United States. And that is a very good thing that the United States has done. And it's messy. It's not satisfying. It's not as satisfying as it would be. It was very sad. I remember this. It was very satisfying to go in there and destroy Saddam Hussein's government in Iraq and capture him. And his execution was an international scandal, but it was still satisfying to go in and take that guy out. But, we broke it, we bought it, and Iraq is still disastrous 20 years later. And the hope is that with just this steady, calm, boring pressure, the Department of State is, I think, the only cabinet, or it's one or two cabinet positions or U.S. government departments that goes back to the founding of the country. So the Department of State is still going to be there in 20 years, pressuring Sudan in a better direction.
Would this have anything to do with Biden's government, or would this have happened regardless who was in charge?
I would love, as a bit of a Democratic partisan, to say, oh, no, this is because Biden and the Democrats are the adults in the room and they're in power there. But no, actually, the October coup did happen in 2021, but the 2019 transition, where the protesters initially forced the military junta into this initial transition power sharing agreement, was under Trump. And there's actually, I remember this specifically because I was like, good Lord, there were actually good
outcomes,
positive comments, not just from Mike Pompeo, but from John Bolton, who's usually one of my biggest hate objects, actually was saying the right stuff about Sudan. And in part because we just don't care that much about Sudan, we were able to do the right thing, and under the Trump and Biden.
So would that have anything to do with the Abraham Accord?
Yes, it does. This will take us a little off the track of America positivity, but there's definitely, certainly in the Trump administration, and to some degree, to a smaller degree in the Biden administration, thankfully, there was definitely some Abraham Accords pressure. Sudan is a country which is somewhat rare in the Arab world that has had functioning elections. A lot of these elections have been sort of referendums on, is Bashir doing a good job? And if not, we'll shoot you, that sort of thing. Not quite that straightforward. But back in the 80s, they had real elections, and I think they might have had one or two since. So the idea of getting Sudan into this Abraham Accords framework that the Trump administration came up with, this idea of Arab countries creating more peaceful relationships with Israel, Sudan would have been a great coup, because the countries that they'd gotten to sign on prior to Sudan were the United Arab Emirates, was Bahrain one of them, and Morocco. These are all monarchies. Morocco has much more serious parliamentary attempts than either the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain, but it's still a monarchy. And there's, no matter how much they're trying to move away from it, it's still a fairly absolute monarchy. They're trying. But to get Sudan, which is or has been an Arab democracy, on board with the Abraham Accords would be quite a coup. And I think there was some back and forth and heavy, heavy pressure on the civilian leader before the October 2021 coup. I would argue that a lot of the decline in legitimacy of the initial civilian members of the Sudanese government before the military came back with another coup, a lot of the decline in their legitimacy probably came from Sudan being more or less forced to sign on to the Abraham Accords. So I think that was a pretty irresponsible thing that the Trump administration did. I'm actually a big fan of democracy, and I wish that the United States would do more to actually support democratic experiments that develop. It seems like we're very interested in supporting democratic experiments in places that we are currently occupying, which is, no, it had a pretty indifferent record, not indifferent, pretty negative record. Places like Iraq
Well,
and
it seems like
Afghanistan.
quite often places that America intervene for, democratic means, air quotes, it often goes horribly wrong. And I think maybe Afghanistan's a good example.
It's a great example. And the problem is, so Sudan is probably, this democratic transition, as rough as it is one of the most hopeful things happening in the Arab world. The most hopeful by far thing that happened in the Arab world was between 2011 and 2021. Tunisia, the country that launched the Arab Spring, did a full-on, unquestionably democratic experiment, representative.
It was always considered to be the one country that it seemed to have a positive aspect, the Arab Spring.
Yeah, they had a constitutional system. Democracy is a loaded term, but it was a representative democracy. It had peaceful transitions of power, at least one new constitution, and by everybody not grading on a curve, not with the soft bigotry of low expectations, Tunisia had a full-on European, North American style political system with free speech, this, that, and the other thing, and it failed largely for economic reasons that were out of the control of the Tunisian government. And it's always been incredibly frustrating to me that the United States it literally would have taken $5 billion. The Tunisian democracy has been, well, it was first the Tunisian democracy, and now it's the Tunisian autocracy, has spent years.
Would that be another spin-off from Libya collapsing?
Very much so, very much so. But they've spent years, Tunisia and Libya do share a border after all. They have spent years, first the democracy, now the autocracy, negotiating over something like $1.5 billion from the IMF. And I think that if democracy is really something the United States cares about, we should have just given them a $2 billion grant. Just given them one time, 2/3 of what we give Israel every year.
Yeah, to show that you care about democracy. Oh, yeah. When you put it like that, it's really sad.
Oh, it's shocking. It's absolutely shocking.
Because that's only really for military purposes.
It's mostly for, well, the components of the aid that we give Israel and also Egypt. We give Egypt about $2 billion a year. And that's mostly for military purposes as well. Tunisia did get money from the United States to the tune of, I don't know, tens or maybe even $100 million a year, but it was exclusively, again, for counterterrorism purposes, which mostly is money that allows the military to buy U.S. weapons, which is essentially a way of writing checks to
not for funding schools and buying food.
Exactly. So yeah, Tunisia's very sad, but again, Rory, we're falling away. This is the Thanksgiving positive about America episode.
Happy episode.
And I stand by it, even with Trump administration's Abraham Accords chicanery. I think that the U.S. record in Sudan over the past 3 years is very positive, and it's worth emphasizing that it's positive in the face of all of those countervailing forces. Usually if Saudi Arabia and the UAE really like a guy, we'll let them get away with supporting them. Usually if they're doing counterterrorism stuff for us, helping us get kickbacks for the Pentagon and associated agencies and companies in the United States, we'll let them get away with stuff. But the U.S. government decided to do the right thing in Sudan, and it is slowly, no guarantee at all for success, but slowly pushing Sudan forward in a positive way. And I think the United States should be commended for that.
Is there any other regions you feel America should be commended for?
I think Armenia, actually. I think how we've been doing in Armenia is quite surprisingly positive.
Is that just because Armenia sounds a bit like America?
Yeah, that could be it. That could be it. But the thing is, Rory, we haven't, I would argue the Armenia-Azerbaijan relationship is tremendously fraught. And it's something that we've treated fairly well over the past 3 years because we haven't chosen sides. We're fairly friendly to both
Well,
of
because
those
Turkey's
sides.
on the Azerbaijani side, aren't they?
They are. They are.
Which is a NATO member, so you'd sort of think America might side that way.
Indeed. Indeed.
Has America become much more powerful in the area purely because Russia has given up?
There's certainly some truth to that. I think it's a little overstated, but for sure. Yeah, that the Russian loss in Ukraine is a big factor in the United States having the opportunity to exert a positive influence. So what's interesting is there's not just the Azerbaijan connection with Turkey that makes the United States sort of how interested we are in being positive towards Turkey over the past decade is, of course, we'll probably do an episode on that at some point. But the NATO extension to Azerbaijan, there's also, and this is another example of the United States ignoring a country that we tend to defer to a little too often. Israel is a big fan of Azerbaijan. You'd think that Israel and Armenia, as sort of the solidarity of surviving the worst genocides of the 20th century, would be fans, but actually the Israelis have been cultivating Azerbaijan for at least a decade now because there are a lot of...
Iran?
Exactly. There are a lot of Azeris in Iran, and the relationship between Iran and Azerbaijan is not always so positive. So the Israelis are sort of like, well, we're not so much into the genocide solidarity, but we're into the possibility of potentially destabilizing Iran. So we had a lot of forces exerting us towards being positive towards Azerbaijan. But we should also remember that there are a ton of forces that push us towards being positive towards Armenia. Armenia has it's probably the second largest and second wealthiest diaspora community in the United States, or it was in the 20th century, I think.
What makes them wealthy?
A lot of things that have helped other diaspora communities. Armenians were traditionally in the Ottoman Empire, had networks throughout the Ottoman Empire, and they were Christian. So the Europeans coming into the Ottoman Empire had affinities with Armenian populations in the Ottoman Empire, Greek populations in the Ottoman Empire, and Jewish populations in the Ottoman Empire. And those three classes managed to do very well in the latter Ottoman Empire as industrialization sped up. The British infiltrated economically more and more. Armenians, Greeks, and Jewish populations tended to be the folks who interfaced with Europeans. And it wasn't just the British, it was Italian and French as well. And those populations got richer. And as happens with disturbing regularity across history, they were heavily resented for that. And the Ottoman Turkish state committed a genocide against the Armenians, which is pretty horrible. And I know I'm making Turkish audiences cringe when I say that, but it is what it is.
I feel a lot of your maybe Turkish fans might agree with you, though.
I think that's probably true. If they speak English and are interested in my content,
and they're a fan of your work,
yeah, they're probably on board with that. But so famously, the Kardashians, of course, are Armenian.
Okay.
Kim Kardashian herself was a big advocate for Armenia, both in the 2020.
And she's recently become a lawyer, hasn't she?
Has she? Oh, she's followed in her her family's footsteps. Oh, well, that's very...
I think maybe this year or last year she finalized it.
Oh, good for her. Did she pass the bar, or she just finished law school?
You're asking a little too much there.
Because
I think she's a bona fide lawyer.
Well, because if she passed the bar in California, that's impressive. California is famously the most difficult of the bar exams to pass in the United States because the United States is, of course, always going to make things more complicated than is necessary. We don't have national certification for attorneys in the United States. Every state has its own bar. I am a member of the New York bar, which is probably the second hardest, or at least it was 10 years ago, but California is far and away the most difficult bar exam. So I'd be very impressed with Kim Kardashian if she took it past the Californian bar.
Apparently she passed the baby bar exam.
Oh, I don't know what that is.
Last year.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know what that is either.
Yeah.
So she's on the way, it seems.
Because there are some states that do not have particularly stringent. I think there's some states that as long as you go to law school in their state, you're just automatically an attorney, which is quite something. Quite something. Anyway, we're getting off topic. So I think the United States has a lot of reasons to support both Armenia and Azerbaijan. And over the past 3 years, I think they've done a great job I think the U.S. government, the Department of State specifically, has done a great job of exerting their influence where it was useful. Well, I guess we got to go back to the 1990s. So both Armenia and Azerbaijan were a part of the Soviet Union. And in the 1990s, Armenia was by far the more powerful of the two. Azerbaijan was always more populous. I believe they were always more populous. That would have been very quick work to get more populous over the past 30 years. I believe Azerbaijan has about 8 to 10 million people, and Armenia really only has 1 or 2 or 3 million people. But Armenia, as the Soviet Union was falling apart, Armenians were not just already successful diaspora communities in the United States and France significantly. They were also much more interweaved in the power structures of the Soviet Union than the Azeris were. So they were in very good stead in the late 80s and 90s when the Soviet Union was falling apart. And that was probably, maybe am I forgetting something big here? So Yugoslavia was not actually part of the Soviet Union. It was part of the communist bloc. But of the Soviet Unions, I think Soviet states, I believe Armenia and Azerbaijan had the nastiest experience of dissolution of the Soviet Union. It started out in the 80s before Soviet Union had even fallen apart. They started ripping each other to shreds. And then it was...
Well, it was seen as when they were all in the Union that kind of things weren't as important. And then, once the sort of the likelihood of independence came along, it got very vicious.
Exactly. And it devolved to the point of a full state-on-state war as these states were being formed. And I think the Armenians had a real head start on forming that state. They had outside funding. They had better weapons. And what they were able to do was not just take control of Nagorno-Karabakh, a famously Armenian majority jurisdiction in Azerbaijan. They were able to also take 6 other jurisdictions about the size of Nagorno-Karabakh, of Azeri territory, and just full-on ethnically cleanse 600,000 Azeris out of that territory in the 90s. So ethnically cleansed, I tend to, the definition is very clear in my mind. That does not mean that they genocided, full-on, executed 600,000 people. That means they forced 600,000 people out of their homes. So there's a large population of folks who are probably now realizing that they don't want to move back to that territory because it might be nicer in Baku. But I mean, really, and I think in the United States, because we do have this somewhat systematic media bias towards the Armenians, we really underplay and oversimplify the conflict and where it was in 2020. In 2020, the Armenians, I do believe, have some interest in the health and autonomy of Nagorno-Karabakh, one jurisdiction within Azerbaijan, but they were also holding on to all this territory around it that they had no right to under any international law. So in 2020, after 35 years of Azerbaijan attempting to take that territory through negotiation, and crucially, as Azerbaijan formed a state, formed a military, and ended up being much wealthier than Armenia because of oil and gas resources. They had spent 25 years trying to get this back through negotiation. And then things fell apart and the Azeris invaded. So I think the first thing that the United States did right in 2020 was stood off. I think more vocally in 2020, you had Kim Kardashian yelling genocide and a lot of pressure on the U.S. government to do something about this. But the State Department actually knew what was going on and could see that no matter how, and every civilized human should always be against war and for negotiation and diplomacy, but the United States, the Department of State, the U.S. government could see that there were reasons why the Azeris were doing what they were doing, and that the Armenians' cries of virtue and remember the genocide were less than worth giving full credit to put it. And I think that was very good. But I think what has also been very good is that the U.S. government has recognized that the character of this conflict has changed from 2020 to 2022.
Hugely?
Vastly. Because what happened was Azerbaijan won in 2020. There's no other way to look at it. I'm not somebody who's big on the technical aspects of warfare, but there's apparently, if you Google it, there's some very interesting lessons about the use of drones, this, that, and the other thing. The Azeris made great use of both Turkish and Israeli drones to just cream the Armenians, and they won. They took their territory back. The problem is that the Azeris have a really nasty form of government. It's essentially a hereditary dictatorship, and they've organized themselves since the formation of the independent state of Azerbaijan in the 90s. They've organized themselves against fighting the Armenians. And it's really hard to acknowledge that you've won once you've done that, and your dictatorship is based on fighting Armenia. So what resolved the conflict in 2020 was the Russians finally sort of stepping in and saying, look, we'll protect Nagorno-Karabakh, we will protect the line between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And that worked for a couple of years.
Until they suddenly needed a large amount of soldiers.
Indeed. And to be clear, there still are Russian troops.
I get the feeling those Russian troops are very happy to be there.
I think you are very right.
Like the ones in Transnistria are like, can we just stay here forever?
Yeah, I think they'd enjoy that. But there are fewer of them, and they are less intimidating troops by far. And specifically in September of this year, in September 2022, as the Russian military was being humiliated in northern Ukraine, the offensive around Kharkiv, as the Russian government was being humiliated there, Azerbaijan decided to start pushing its luck. And at this point, when that victorious Azeri dictatorship that had won the war in 2020, mostly what they had to do was start invading Armenia. And I think that is a fair characterization of what started to happen. There's a lot of fog of war stuff here. There's a lot of, you can get very different stories from the Azeri side, but it looks pretty indisputable that the Azeris started attacking not Armenian territory that the Armenians unfairly claimed, but Armenian territory that is part of the country of Armenia, internationally recognized by everybody. And Putin didn't really he had other things on his hands. And this is where the U.S. Department of State stepped in. I am not a big fan of Nancy Pelosi and her traveling to places. I think her traveling to Taiwan was essentially an attempt to start a war between the United States and China. But
then there's rumors it was to affect the stock market as well.
I had not heard that.
Oh, well, her husband is considered like a stock market genius. Huh. But the idea was he knew it would, spook the markets. And if he knew it was happening before anyone else, because, Nancy's his wife, he could make a killing. Wow.
The ability of U.S. Congress folks to invest in the markets the way they do is quite something.
Oh, yeah, it's outstanding.
Yeah, another topic for another episode. But a trip that she did take in September, which I think was very useful, was a trip to Armenia. Of course, Nancy Pelosi is the congressperson for one of the most notable Armenian diasporas in the United States, in the sort of San Francisco area. Regardless, of how self-interested it might have been. It was a very good move by Pelosi, and crucially, it was backed up by a continuing series of diplomatic events and diplomatic pressure from the highest levels of the U.S. State Department. Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, not a guy I'm a big fan of, but in this case, doing exactly the right thing. It is ongoing pressure. The Azerbaijani government has been made aware that the United States cares about this. And so far, that's enough. Simply indicating ongoing U.S. interest in this and the fact that the United States will not accept the way that we did more or less accept the 2020 offensive. We will not accept serious incursions into Armenian territory.
Has there been like a ceasefire signed or anything like that?
It's not at that point. What's interesting is that Putin has belatedly inserted himself into this as well. He managed to sit down with both Pashinyan and Aliyev, the respective heads of the Azerbaijani and Armenian governments. But I think that's more of a sort of a catch up, we matter too type thing. And that's probably an acknowledgement by the Azeri government that they're not going to be able to get what they want from the United States. So what the United States continues to do is pressure these governments towards some kind of agreement. They crucially haven't had much of an agreement. There was a more multilateral agreement or quasi-ceasefire in 2020 over the Russian peacekeepers being sent into Nagorno-Karabakh, the part of Azerbaijan that's still very Armenian and on the border. But there were provisos in those agreements that were not honored, have not been honored by either side about transit, this, that, and the other thing. So Azerbaijan started saying, well, we got success violently last time. Let's push things violently again. So what the United States is actively working for, Blinken continues to meet with the foreign ministers of both countries in Washington, D.C. and pressure them further towards this, is some kind of interim agreement. Again, like Sudan, we're not going to wake up tomorrow with Switzerland. Yeah, it's not going to all work out. There's every chance that we could be dealing with a horrific situation in Azerbaijan and Armenia next year. But we were dealing with what was beginning to look like a horrific situation between Armenia and Azerbaijan in September.
It's also, isn't Turkey not that keen on Armenia?
It's interesting. I think that...
And is there land they would like to nab for themselves?
I would say no. I think that the Turks understand that they have no matter how invested members of the Turkish government and some members of the Turkish opposition are in denying the genocide of 1915, I think they're conscious that it would be very bad for Turkey if they were to start stealing Armenian land. I think that there's an open question of how far Turkey would be willing to support Azerbaijan in taking Armenian land. Who knows? I think Turkey would probably be given pause if the Azeri military rolled into Nagorno-Karabakh and started slaughtering Armenians. I think that the Turkish government would have serious problems with that, not because they care at all about Armenians, but because they care about how the Turkish government is viewed. And the Turkish government has really, really been pushing for some kind of diplomatic rapprochement with Armenia. Of course, that's impossible with the current Armenian government. We're like, yeah, you just supported Azerbaijan in this war they won against us. So obviously that's not something...
So in this situation, America is one of the more neutral parties, oddly, compared to Turkey, which is not very much an Armenian side.
Absolutely. Interestingly, the Armenians' two greatest supports at this point are probably the United States and Iran.
And maybe Russia.
Well, it depends. Russia was...
Interesting bedfellows.
Indeed. Well, so the Armenians have felt, even in 2020, the Armenians felt quite betrayed by Russia because they very incorrectly, and I would argue inappropriately, assumed that their security agreement with Russia meant that Russia was obligated to defend Armenian custody of Azerbaijani
Well, it's considered
land.
like the Russian NATO, I hear bandied
Yeah,
about
the
a lot.
CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, I believe, something along those lines. So anyway, I'm very proud of us today, Rory. I think we talked at some length about two
All the good,
positive things that the United
the
States has done.
takeaway I'm getting is this is a side of America you'd like to see more of.
Exactly, Rory. Exactly.
And that is something we can be thankful for at Thanksgiving. The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. Yeah.